because we're realizing how hazardous this air is. It envelops the region and doesn't go away for many weeks at a time. So, the impetus for this project really came from this idea that millions, billions of people are breathing in this very hazardous, toxic air. What are some political economy foundations for why this is happening? And can we do something from those lessons to improve the quality of air that the people are breathing? So in fact, 42 of the 50 most polluted cities in the world at this point are now in South Asia. This is a region with over 1.5 billion people who are living there. The biggest countries there. I'm from Pakistan, it's the fifth largest country. And in fact, we're going to concentrate today in this project on this area, which has the worst air quality in the world, which is just the northern Indian subcontinent. And given that 1 in 4 humans live in this region, we call this in the paper the largest public health emergency in the world. It receives very little attention in scholarly circles. So this is our attempt at trying to highlight it in more conversations. So of course, scholars have written that there are huge costs from breathing in toxic air, from strokes and diabetes, respiratory diseases, etc. But it also releases the specific phenomena that we're going to study, which is crop residue burning, which I'm going to explain in a second. Also releases black carbon, which is an accelerant for climate change. And to make you realize how large the problem is, whereas COVID killed about 6 million people in the first 2 years, air pollution globally kills over 4 million. And a paper I read yesterday estimated that about 2 million people are dying in South Asia from air pollution every year. So every single year, there's this huge calamity that's happening. Anthropologists call this slow violence. So maybe that's why we're not paying enough attention to it. But it is certainly something that we as scholars should really think about more carefully. So, we're more familiar in our disciplines, perhaps, with some common sources of air pollution, such as car emissions, industrial emissions, etc. What's less well understood, or at least from a political economy lens, is agricultural fires or agricultural crop burning. So what is that? To give you a very quick history, the Green Revolution incentivized or brought in these high-yield varieties to the region, and together with other complements like irrigation networks that were also set up under the British, there was an intensive cropping cycle introduced, often locally called the rice-wheat cycle, which means that while previously people were only putting in 1 crop in the year or 2 crops in the year, now they were doing 2, 3 crops in the year, which meant that timelines were extremely compressed. And people had to do this rapid turnaround to make sure that they harvested the crop quickly, put in the next crop so that it can catch the monsoons in the right time, etc. And this becomes extremely relevant when they actually harvest the rice crop, which happens in the fall, and then they have about 2 weeks or less to put in the wheat crop, the winter wheat crop, so that it catches monsoon in time and matures to the right amount. So while traditionally in the olden days, the stubble that was left over when they harvested the rice crop was cleared by hand, which is a very labor-intensive technology. And now that labor is migrating more and more to urban areas, it's becoming scarcer. People instead now just burn. And so from a farmer's perspective, you can see that it's individually rational to just burn the stubble that's left over. It costs them nothing. They have to get a little bit of gasoline and perhaps a matchbox. But scholars have estimated that the externalities from burning one crop, one field, are extremely high, that from a policy perspective, it makes complete sense to stop stubble burning altogether. Again, people who are from the region are familiar with this. I give the example of this video game called Silent Hill, if you've ever played it or watched the movie, which is where the bad things start happening when ash starts falling from the sky. So on the right is exactly that scenario, where in Delhi, you can see that on a relatively clear day, you can still see some smog in the back air. But it's really a hellscape during the fire season. And this is my hometown of Lahore, where you can see that thick cloud of smog on a not even the worst day of air pollution. There's only 500 AQI. My home monitor AQI goes up to 999, and then it stops because humans aren't meant to breathe in air like this. And on a clear day, you do see actually blue skies once in a while. So, of course, people have started thinking about this problem a lot, and many people have proposed solutions to this. There have been RCTs run which suggest that if you actually pay farmers, they can have that can have some efficacy. If you pay them to not burn, that can have some efficacy. If you switch or mandate the switching of the time at which people burn, perhaps that might reduce the pollution burden on people on the receiving end. However, we're going to contend that any policy that you can think of to curb this problem will require some effective governance and thinking carefully about the role of government and government personnel, what their incentives are, holds the key to thinking about how we might make some progress on this seemingly intractable problem of resolving crop burning. So, and this is particularly the case because agricultural burning introduces some unique governance challenges relative to other types of pollution that you might be more familiar with, for example, industrial pollution. And this is, what are those features? Well, first, farmers are setting fires dispersed in space. So there are millions of farmers completely dispersed in space, unlike perhaps industry, which might be more concentrated in certain locations. So such that the marginal value of effort from the bureaucrat's perspective is quite low. And this is because, A, there's a large N in terms of the number of farmers that they have to control, but also each particular farmer's burning activity contributes minimally to the total problem, right? So if I stop one farmer, if I exert all that effort, why is it the case, the efficacy of that one action from a bureaucrat's perspective is going to be relatively low. So that further disincentivizes effort from the bureaucrat's perspective. And of course, then, air pollution also has these other issues such as difficulties of attributing the source of the pollution. Unlike a river where if somebody's upstream if the sludge is going out of the industry, it's polluting the river, people downstream can see it, photograph it, and know, okay, that's where the sludge is coming from. In the case of air, changing wind directions, etc., make attributions very hard. Air pollution crosses many, many jurisdictions, which makes cooperation hard, and that further exacerbates the problem. So in fact, India and Pakistan have both adopted regulation that outlaws crop burning. It's been quite a while since they've done that. However, the incentives for regulatory implementation are quite weak. And the reasons for that have to do with these three reasons that I highlighted, and therefore enforcement has been uneven. So just to give you a flavor of what bureaucrats are actually doing on the ground, I'm going to give you a few quotes from Washington Post and other newspapers. So here's an article from the Washington Post from 2018, which says that the central government has earmarked money to help farmers buy machinery, things like happy seeders, which convert the straw that's left over after rice is harvested into other products that they can use. And there are also large-scale awareness campaigns complete with song. This is Washington Post. They're going to mention banyan trees in a second. I'm going to show you that also. There's strict vigilance by the district administration. Farmers were afraid of penalties, so they can actually book farmers and put them in jail. The law gives them that leverage, and we're going to collect some data on that a little later in the paper. And they are, in fact, collecting penalties from farmers across the region. They're also visiting each of the villages in their areas, and they're trying to convince people from not burning, telling them that for religious reasons they should stop doing it. So in fact they're using both carrots and sticks across the region. So there is some effort that the bureaucrats are making towards stopping air pollution. So what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to say that contrary to this idea that this problem is completely intractable, bureaucrats cannot do anything because of the nature of the pollution itself. Actually, bureaucrats can exert substantial control if their incentives align. We're going to causally identify changes in their incentives to control by shifts in wind direction, which is going to affect whether the bureaucrat's home jurisdiction bears the brunt of the pollution or if the pollution goes to a neighbor. And I'm going to show you that bureaucrats care about that a lot. In fact, because winds shift over time, they're going to control pollution in the same area when the wind blows pollution into their own jurisdiction, and they're going to stop it. They're going to allow it when it goes into a neighboring jurisdiction. We're going to examine the dynamics of governance and how it responds to some of these challenges. We're going to show you that the incentives are sharpest the closer you get to the border, right? Because as you approach the border, more of your own district can get polluted, or more of the pollution can be thrown into the next jurisdiction. So the incentives are sharpest for regions that are closest to the district border. We're going to show you that actually it is the case that pollution monotonically responds to bureaucratic incentives the closer you get to a border, whether it's the upwind border or the downwind border, exactly as theory would predict. We're also going to show you that this, and so the interpretation is that this moves beyond just saying that these are jurisdictional incentives. In fact, it's not just polluting your neighbor that previous work has written about. Here I'm going to show you that the data suggests that bureaucrats are actually recalibrating at a very fast rate, something that we didn't really understand previously. In terms of mechanisms, we're going to collect new data on bureaucratic punishment in a really large area. I'm going to show you that it actually creates deterrence among farmers. The idea being that if I punish a particular farmer, there are other farmers in the region who are going to not burn anymore. And that might be one particularly powerful way of thinking about how, in the face of low marginal value of effort from the bureaucrat's perspective, you can get some policy traction through this idea that farmers are going to have some deterrence once they see other people being punished in their region. And if there is time, we're going to show you that all of these things have severe health impacts. I'm going to use a climate model to trace the effect of every single fire on health outcomes among children. Pregnant women are breathing in toxic air during the 9 months of their pregnancy, and that's going to affect the health outcomes of the children who are born. So we're going to show that actually there's a huge effect on health outcomes from crop stubble burning. And we're going to then do some back of the envelope calculations to suggest that, in fact, this bureaucratic action, if you were to take it seriously in the design of policy, you could have substantial gains in terms of saving reducing child mortality. I'll pause here for a second to see if there are any questions. Okay, everyone's stunned. Great. Okay, so let me now go into the details. I'm going to show you only one table in this. We try to keep it more figures than tables to keep things interesting. So in terms of the data, we collect about a decade of data from satellites. We have daily fire data from several satellites. We have monthly wind patterns data, which will show you which direction the wind is likely to blow in. And it comes for this entire region. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on this sort of high pollution area in the northern Indian subcontinent, mostly for computational reasons, but this is also where a large amount of rice is being produced, which is, and together with the idea that there are Himalayas over here, the problem is particularly compounded in this region. So we're going to focus on this region with about 18 million observations at the unit of a 5 kilometer square grid cell. So what we're going to do is we're going to divide this region into districts, which are jurisdictions of the key bureaucrats that we're thinking about. These are bureaucrats that you've seen in other papers. They come from the civil services exam, or they're recruited from the state civil services typically. Each district is going to be divided into these small grids that you see in green over here, where each grid is about a 5 kilometer square grid. So we're going to fix those locations with grid cell fixed effects, and we're going to see what happens if there's a fire in this part of the district versus this part, which I'm going to show you in a second. So part one of the results is going to think about whether bureaucrats can actually exert control over pollution patterns or not. So the objective is to establish if a grid cell, these small locations within a district, is going to be a source of pollution for me, my own jurisdiction as the bureaucrat, or it's going to be a source of pollution for a neighboring jurisdiction. So how might we think about that? So imagine that this blue line is a district, and each of these boxes is the 5 kilometer grid cell that I showed you earlier. So if a fire were to take place in this region, if a farmer were to burn their stubble, and the wind was in this direction coming in from the northwest, then this entire area in red is potentially polluted by the smoke from that fire. Now consider another fire which is much further downwind. So then you can see that the area of the district that's polluted by the fire is much smaller compared to the first one. And then it could be the case that the wind shifts, where you keep the same location, but now the same location has become the source of pollution for my home district versus my neighbor's district. So this is the idea that we're going to use. Yeah?
How often do the winds shift?
I'm going to show you the data in just 1 second. So the idea again here is that changes in wind direction shift the strategic calculus for me, the bureaucrat, in terms of whether I should exert effort in controlling fires in that area or not within my district. Okay. Do we have that slide? Yeah. So this is what the data look like. Here we have districts that we plot over time, and you can see that as winds shift, certain areas of the district become a source of pollution for me, myself, the district manager, and then other areas become the source of pollution for my neighboring jurisdiction. I have 30 minutes or 40 minutes? Okay. 50-50. It's a niche joke, yeah, sorry. Okay. So we run a regression where we put the number of fires on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side we have this variable which is the downwind area larger than the upwind area, and then we're going to break this up a little later in the presentation. Then we have a bunch of fixed effects, including location fixed effects, which are going to fix the specific location and identify off of the changes in wind direction, so whether that specific location becomes a source of pollution for my district or for my neighbor's district. Any questions on this? Yeah. Yeah, great question. So what we do in this paper is we're interested in thinking about the beliefs of bureaucrats in terms of which way the wind is likely to blow. So what we do is we monitor this chart that you saw is going to take the average of the wind in the last 10 years for that month here. So for example, if you're in November 2012, it's going to take the average of the wind direction from November 2001 to 2011 to proxy for the beliefs of bureaucrats in terms of which direction is the wind blowing in that particular month.
Sorry, just to make sure I understand. So I'm a bureaucrat, and I want to know how badly is my district going to be affected. So I think back on the last 10 years, you said? X number of years, and think like, okay, we're in September, the wind usually blows this way, so that's how I think the wind is going to blow this September.
Exactly. So that helps you fix ideas on which parts of your district you should concentrate on, and certain parts are going to lead to pollution in my own jurisdiction, and other parts are going to lead to pollution in my neighbor's jurisdictions.
And do you guys have any direct evidence that bureaucrats know anything about any of this stuff?
Well, so agriculture is one of the primary jobs of a lot of the bureaucrats, and actually if you talk to the agriculture department people, they have very precise information on this kind of stuff. Like they have to have this information, right, because they need to know what time the rain comes in, how hot the weather is in certain time, because that determines the yield of the crop. So they're very sensitive to this information. Yeah.
Actually, a similar question to Rob's, which is, so you're saying that the bureaucrats' kind of perceptions are based on this kind of roughly 10-year experience with the wind, except that what is the tenure of these districts? Because I imagine that the bureaucrat you're referring to is the district collector.
So let me clarify. This is our proxy for what we believe are their beliefs. We're not saying that they're literally like they're going to go back in for over 10 years, look at the data and form beliefs. So the idea here is that the district manager, usually the IAS officer or the admin at the Pakistan Administrative Services officer, will have a whole team. They'll have the agriculture person, et cetera, and they are the ones who are career bureaucrats, and they will inform or have a discussion with the bureaucrat. So the idea here is that the bureaucrat is coming in with their own beliefs, whatever, but they're also learning from the experience of the entire team that comes in. So we say bureaucrat here, but what we mean is the district management.
Except that at the district level, my understanding is that that's not so specialized. It's usually the district collector. It's not as if like at the state level, yes, there would be an agriculture department. My understanding of working in this is the district collector essentially has a lot of incentive and a lot of initiative on his or her own part in terms of how much they kind of construct this bureaucracy. So I guess like for a future iteration, it would be helpful to see just what the kind of structure of the bureaucracy, whose perceptions are kind of seem to be pretty critical, looks like. Because like speaking to district collectors in my own field research, sometimes they would have an agriculture person, but many times it was just them.
I see. My understanding is that all the line ministries are organized by district also. So for example, you'll have an agriculture secretary at the provincial level or state level, and then you'll have the district manager for each of the line ministry. Education has their own district manager, agriculture has their own district manager, and they all report to the district collector or whatever the name is in the particular state. And so in that sense, the district manager has these line ministry personnel who form the head of their line ministry and reports directly to the district manager. But we can definitely collect information on all this and report it in the paper.
Sorry, so two questions. One, I think my previous question, how often, do winds shift? Like in September, the wind is just continuously blowing in from the northwest, or it's blowing in from the northwest at 8 a.m., but then by noon it's blowing in from a different, how often do they shift? And then second, is there a predictable pattern, year after year? So if I look back over this 10-year period, and I use that 10-year period to infer, okay, the wind is probably going to come from the northwest, what's the probability that I'm going to be right?
You're probably going to be right 99% of the time, because you can actually trace this rolling average that we construct with the real data, and it maps on almost perfectly. There are very few aberrations, as there should be in weather data, but you can see that it goes up and down if you plot the wind direction as the bearing on the y-axis. And so how often does the wind shift? Well, it's not just the wind shift, but I'll come back to that in a second. Usually it shifts twice or thrice in the year, right, based on which way the weather patterns for the entire region. But the identification doesn't come only from the wind shift. It comes with the interaction of the wind shift with the shape of the district. Because whether a specific location is going to pollute my own district is going to be based on the area in this definition of the treatment that is downwind from that. So you sketch a 180-degree line and you map the area downwind versus upwind. So the identification is not just the wind direction, it's also the shape of the district itself.
Yeah, I get that. I guess I'm just wondering, you know, if this is so incredibly predictable, like, so yeah, maybe the interaction then is what's really giving you identification, but I would think that if this is so predictable that I can look back over 10 years of history and say, I know exactly where the wind is going to blow next month, there should be all sorts of endogenous responses, presumably, right, that I would develop over time. And so, like, I don't understand how that gets you clean identification. Because the whole idea would be the wind is random, right? And so that's what's getting you identification. But in this case, the wind is not random at all. The wind is completely predictable.
So what kind of endogenous responses are you worried about?
Well, so presumably, right, so if I'm a bureaucrat, and I just know, right, I live in an area now where I know precisely, you know, when exactly I'm gonna need to be more active versus less active, and so maybe that, like, you know, maybe there's a selection mechanism that ensures, okay, in this district where we know we're gonna get really affected by these winds in these particular months, you know, we want the sort of leader who's gonna be extremely proactive in trying to, you know, stamp out these small fires.
And that's fine. I think all of those are consistent mechanisms with the story that we're trying to sketch, which is bureaucrats are very sensitive to their jurisdictional incentives in this part. So all of those are, I think, the types of stories that we, in fact, are okay with.
I mean, I would also imagine that like individual farmers' decisions would then, if it is so predictable.
I'm going to come to that in 1 second, yeah.
Okay.
And that doesn't explain the results. Yeah.
So it seems like you, in your model, you have not only interested in like crop burning and wildfires, right? Because you cannot control if it's the causes of like the crop burning or wildfire. But for like crop burning, there should be a very specific pattern because it happens in certain months. For example, at the end of the harvest.
Yes.
But for wildfires,
There are no wildfire. There's minimal forest cover in these regions.
Okay.
And also, yes, on your first point, exactly, that's where we see the results, which is it happens in rice-producing areas, and it happens during the harvest months.
excellent. So, second question is, so how could you like figure out the affected areas in confronting winds? For example, like if they're like confronting winds from the north and the south at the same time simultaneously, how do you determine the affected areas in the region?
If they're conflicting winds, you mean?
Confronting.
It's the average wind direction. So the winds are, if they're meeting in the middle, it's going to create some bearing for the wind,
Okay.
and that's what's measured in the satellite data.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, last question before I proceed. Yeah.
In terms of the endogenous responses, is it like how do bureaucrats get allotted to a district? Like, is it possible that the state agricultural department is sending a bureaucrat to a district knowing that this is a district that pollutes all the other districts? So is that a concern?
It's not a concern for identification because we always have within district variation. However, if they're doing that, that's lovely because we would love to study that. My sense is that they're not being sensitive at all to these kinds of questions. Like if there is a particular bureaucrat who is very good at somehow fighting crop burning, given the amount of externality here, they should totally be using all kinds of things that are at their disposal, including selection mechanisms for bureaucrats. But my sense is they're not. We have some data on the movement of officers. I'm not sure if you studied this particular question in it, which is the movement correlated with changes in wind direction, but there's not enough movement to really that be the determining factor.
Right, or correlated with changes in crop burning instances.
How do you mean?
Because like during crop burning season, are bureaucrats being moved from one district to the other?
I see, yeah. I think we can study that pretty easily. We've assembled data on that. Okay, now I'm going to move a little faster. So this is the main event study where At 0, the wind shifts direction such that the same location moves from being a source of pollution for the neighbor towards being a source of pollution for my home district. So everything in the positive time here, the location becomes a source of pollution for me. And so what happens to the number of fires is that they actually decrease by about 10 to 14% in the data. So we don't see patterns of that before the treatment switches the location from being controlled to treated. But then when the wind shifts, the pollution goes down. In the paper, we do a whole bunch of robustness, including instead of taking the area, taking the number of people living downwind versus upwind, changing the way we define the outcome, the treatment, etc., and the results are quite robust. So I'm going to move on to more interesting things. Okay, one concern that Prerna also raised was that, okay, results are not actually driven by bureaucratic concerns, so it's not jurisdictional incentives, but in fact, farmers are somehow extremely these pro-social human beings who care about who's bearing the brunt of air pollution downwind from me versus upwind. And so the idea here is that if it's the case that there are more people living downwind from the farmer versus upwind, let's say, using the same calculus that we defined earlier, farmers will want to reduce the amount of air pollution to combat this versus bureaucrats. So to answer this question, what we do is for each location, we construct these placebo boundaries across the entire region of about 2 million grid cells that we have in the data. The size of this placebo boundary is about the average size of a district, so that we have the same amount of people in the district as in the placebo boundary, and use the same exact logic, which is, let's say the wind is coming from the northwest. How many people live downwind from the farmer in this boundary versus upwind? So the farmer shouldn't really care about the district boundary, but should care about the number of people living downwind versus upwind. And in the paper, we show that there are no effects when the grid is treated for the citizen, in the sense that there are more people downwind versus upwind, and the grid is actually a control grid for the bureaucrat. So all of the effects come from the treated grids for the bureaucrat, but there's no movement if the grid is treated for the citizen but not for the bureaucrat, suggesting that it's actually not farmers' pro-social incentives that are driving the results, and it has something to do with the nature of the jurisdiction itself, which is the district. Okay, so that was part one. So in part one, we showed you that, okay, against this idea that air pollution is quite intractable, bureaucrats are exerting substantial control in where pollution is allowed to occur and where there is some effort exerted to control air pollution. Now I'm going to try to explore some dynamics of responses to these challenges. So first we're going to show you that in this part we're going to show you that pollution reduction is actually quite responsive to the incentives and capacity constraints faced by bureaucrats. So to do this, we're going to we're going to dive deeper into the district and think specifically about different types of locations. So now think of the same district that we had before, and the small boxes are again the same locations as before. Now, if you are in this dark blue area, you're close to the downwind border, such that if somebody burns their crop over here, the pollution is going to be taken to the neighboring jurisdiction. Now imagine that the winds shift and you're in the same location. The pollution from these areas are going to come into your own district, because these places are the most upwind places that there can be in your district. Okay, so now again we're fixing the location within the district, and we're thinking about the incentives across different locations, where if you're closest to the downwind border, the bureaucrat is going to allow pollution to happen, or should allow pollution to happen, because the neighbor bears the brunt. If you move a little bit inside, now the bureaucrat is going to start caring a little bit more, because some parts of the district is going to get polluted. If you move further inside, then the bureaucrat really cares about these locations. Okay. Similarly, for the other direction, it's the same logic, which is if you're very close to this upwind border, bureaucrat really cares about these locations, because more of their jurisdiction gets the pollution. But as you move further and further in towards the downwind border, they care less. And so we study exactly this question, again holding the location fixed but using the changes in wind direction. And we find a very interesting pattern, where what we're going to do here is on the rightmost corner are the locations that are farthest from the border that we're thinking of. And the closest location is the one on the left-hand side. And relative to this farthest point, as you get closer and closer to the upwind border, so the location where I'm going to bear the brunt of the pollution as the bureaucrat, pollution decreases monotonically the closer you get to the district. And this is the differential effect of the downwind border. So to get the effect on the downwind border, you just add this coefficient to this coefficient, and you'll see that it's actually of a very similar size as the downwind border, but flipped. So this is completely, so again, just to sort of summarize, the idea here is that as you get closer to a downwind border, it's in your interest to allow fires to occur because they're going to be carried forward to the neighboring jurisdiction. And as you move closer to the upwind border, it's in your interest to stop fires because your jurisdiction is going to bear the brunt of the pollution. So this separation, I think, is quite interesting because it implies some interesting things about the kinds of things that bureaucrats might be doing. You might have thought that, okay, bureaucrats are completely overloaded with work, and so therefore, any opportunity they get to not do anything, they would happily take. But whenever they have to actually exert active effort to stop pollution, they might not want to do that. These results suggest actually that that's not the case. In fact, the point estimate suggests that they're trading off of those two things quite evenly, actually. Here, they're exerting effort to stop pollution. Here, they're exerting effort they're not exerting effort to allow pollution. In fact, they're getting some time back to do other things that they can. Again, these are all with location fixed effects, so it's the same location, but the identification comes from changes in wind direction. So I'm going to actually, if you have any questions on this graph, ask now because I'm going to show you a bunch of many versions of this in the coming slides. Okay, everybody's on the same page, great. So then we're going to think, so this was the key result in this section, which is that it's not just that they allow pollution or they reduce pollution in certain parts over the others. In fact, they're extremely sensitive in terms of which location within their district they're allowing or curbing pollution. The effect size suggests they trade off both of those things at the same rate. Now what we're going to do is we're going to see, okay, what happens as their capacity problems sort of change a little bit. These are less well identified than all the results you've seen so far, but I think they're still quite informative. So what we're going to do is we're going to think about bureaucrats solving this problem in terms of rice production. So what happens if the total amount of the district that's under rice cultivation increases a lot? So we're going to plot in the dotted lines here the locations that you saw, the locations that have mean rice production, and then in the solid lines here are locations with 1 standard deviation higher rice production in the district as a whole. So the way to think about this is that the infrastructure of district governance are pretty similar across districts. Some districts have more rice production in them, which means that the bureaucrats have to control a bigger crop burning problem in their area, and other districts have lower rice production, so they have a smaller crop burning problem to control in their area. So when the total amount of pollution that's being generated increases, what we find is that you move from these dotted lines to these solid lines, which is that their reliance on the strategic patterns in terms of governance actually increases. So the wedge increases again in both directions, which suggests that if you have more, bureaucrats are again time constrained, as they get more and more of the problem, they're going to rely more on these strategic patterns. One other aspect of this that we study is interjurisdictional coordination. So one way to interpret some of these results so far has been that if it were the case that I could talk to my neighbor, then I could solve this problem because then I would be more sensitive to their concerns and so on. What we do is we say, okay, can we think of a scenario where talking to your neighbor is extremely difficult? There is no legal apparatus for you to do that. Well, and we're going to think of a better example than the India-Pakistan border, where the water system that's shared between India and Pakistan is governed by the Indus Water Treaty, but nothing similarly exists on the air pollution or airshed, as people have started calling it. So if I pollute my neighboring country, there's no mechanism really for me to coordinate over that pollution. In fact, the precise problems of air pollution make that coordination extremely difficult because it's very, one of the impetus for this project was TV debates about whether India was polluting Pakistan or if Pakistan's polluting India most of the time. So people, I think we can answer that question, but we're choosing not to right now. But that's one of the reasons why coordination becomes extremely difficult. So what we're going to do is we're going to just plot the results in the entire sample that we have and only on the India-Pakistan borders districts. Okay, and so that result is here. The dotted line is what I showed you in the previous graph where the wedge occurred. But you can see that on the India-Pakistan border, the size of the wedge is almost 8 to 9 times higher than the size of the wedge in the rest of the sample. Of course, there are many ways to interpret this because the districts bordering in Pakistan have particular characteristics, etc. But one interpretation, at least, is that on this particular border, coordination is absent, and when that happens, perhaps bureaucrats are even more reliant on these strategic patterns than they would be otherwise. We also do some other tests in the paper to show that there is another residue burning pattern which occurs in the summer months when they cut the wheat crop. But the number of fires is lower, but the key thing is that the pollution is not visible to the naked eye, and none of these effects occur in the summer months, they're all driven by the winter months when pollution is also visible because of climatic factors. Okay, just to quickly talk about the mechanisms, what we do is, it's very hard to know for this large area that we study precisely what the bureaucrats are doing. So a lot of the results I've shown you so far are mostly reduced form, and we're kind of inferring bureaucratic behavior from patterns in the data. So one place where we can make some progress is that there is data on severe punishment that bureaucrats have taken against farmers. So we have cases, we can go to the case record data in India, where cases are under the Air Pollution Act of 1981 are registered. And for Pakistan, we collect new data on what are called first information reports, which are police reports, criminal reports against specific farmers. So they're either fined or jailed for crop burning. So we collect all of this data at the district level. And what we want to study is, when a bureaucrat takes this severe punishment against a farmer, what happens to subsequent crop burning in their area? Okay, we show in the data that, as you might expect, bureaucrats are taking these actions in rice areas during harvest months because that's where they should be doing these things, and we want to study what happens to deterrence. So what we find in the paper is that when this punishment occurs, we don't have an effect on the average deterrence in the entire district. So it's not the case that or at least we can't identify in our data that farmers on average reduce crop burning. However, what we find is that if you remember the definition of the treatment from the first result, which is areas where polluting action would pollute the district of the home district of the farmer, those are the areas where we see big effects. So here's the event study for it. We're going to plot the differential effect of the punishment or the penalty to the farmer on the number of fires that occur afterwards in downwind greater than upwind areas versus upwind greater than downwind areas, where the downwind greater than upwind areas are the ones that are going to pollute the home district of the bureaucrat or not. And so what we see is that these areas exhibit the same number of fires, the ones that get the penalty versus not, and then after the bureaucrat exerts a penalty, there's a drop immediately in the number of fires that occur in those areas. So our interpretation of this is that because burning is a one-off event, once a farmer has burned and been punished, they don't really have an opportunity to burn again. So this reduction is coming from other farmers in the area who have not yet burned. Again, the idea here is that the penalty that the bureaucrat can exert, this severe penalty that at least we can measure in our data, creates deterrence amongst other farmers. And so this is particularly powerful if you think about the control of air pollution, because it suggests that this idea that we posited at the beginning, that there's low marginal value of effort from the bureaucrat's perspective, this kind of goes a little against it in the sense that, in fact, if bureaucrats were to take action, they could create deterrence amongst other farmers in the area, potentially raising the marginal return from the smaller effort that they can take among specific farmers. Okay, in the last minute or two, I'm going to talk to you about health impacts before concluding. So our interest here was to also try to link all of these things we've shown you with real health data. And then as we started doing it, we realized actually there's a bigger problem that we'd anticipated, because air pollution causes this issue where you cannot link a polluting action 100 kilometers away to my health outcomes 100 kilometers or so downwind from you. So how can we do that? How can we sort of say that, okay, a farmer upwind from me burned their crop and that has some impact on me downwind from you? To solve this problem, what we did was we took, so in black here are districts, we took all of the fires that occurred in our data and ran a climate model on them, which allows us to trace the trajectory of air pollution particles in space over a 24-hour period. So for all 2 million or so fires, we ran that model, which allows us to know where the pollution from that particular fire went over the next 24 hours period. So for example, for this one fire that I'm showing you here, after 6 hours, this is what the trajectory of the air pollutants looks like from that particular fire. So we use this model to generate to look at all of the pregnant women in these circles that you see, which are DHS clusters. And we said, okay, over the 9 months of their pregnancy, how many of these these pollution particles pass through their home area, and we attribute that entire load of pollution to that particular pregnancy. And so what we can study is some mothers who received a lot of pollution during pregnancy versus other mothers who received less pollution during the pregnancy. What is the child health outcome if we compare those two mothers? So that's what we do. We use these particles that you see over here as instruments for actual pollution that is experienced in those areas, and we study the effect on child mortality. So these are the results. On the left-hand side, you have the reduced form, and on the right-hand side, you have the IV estimate. So you can see these are both the treatments are in standardized units. So the particles is what I showed you on the previous slides. As you move from mean exposure of particles to a 1 standard deviation higher exposure, child mortality increases by 1.3 over a base of about 41 deaths in 1,000 births. So it increases by 1.3 deaths in 1,000 births. But when you instrument the actual pollution in that area with these particles, you see that child mortality actually increases by more than 100% in the specification with all the fixed effects, which include the month in which the child is born, the specific district where the mother lives, and also the birth order of that child. We also have controls for the eldest son, etc., which the literature says are important in this area. So to some extent, this isn't surprising in the sense that, okay, yeah, air pollution should have these massive effects. But on the other hand, it's been, to our knowledge, I don't think anybody else has been able to exactly study the effect of crop burning on any health outcome, because it's very difficult to separate one source of pollution from the other. But now that we've done that, we're also shocked by the magnitude of these effects, which are huge. We can do some back of the envelope calculations to sort of think about what would happen if bureaucrats cared equally about the downwind half of their district as they do about the upwind half of the district. So if they were suddenly allowed to exert the same amount of effort so that they could reduce fires by about 15%, what we would find is that 7 to 20 increase in the child mortality can actually be attributed to these kinds of strategic incentives, which corresponds to about a 15 to 50% decrease in child mortality. So this is just one metric of the kind of effects that can happen if we account for bureaucratic incentives in the type of work that they're doing. Okay, I'm going to conclude by saying that states have an increasingly important role to play in fighting climate change and environmental degradation, so taking their incentives seriously is extremely important. In this paper, we study what is seemingly an intractable problem of resolving air pollution as caused by crop stubble burning. I made the case that there are some features of air pollution that are particularly problematic that make it very difficult to govern, including the dispersed nature of the polluters, the low marginal value of actually controlling one particular polluting action, and the difficulties related to attribution in the causes in the space of air pollution. But I showed you that actually, even in the presence of these, the way the governments are set up can actually exert substantial control in solving, or not solving, but reducing the problem of crop burning. I showed you that bureaucrats are actually quite sensitive in terms of thinking about which location in their area they might want to think about. One result that I showed you was when they take this severe action, there is this idea that creates deterrence among other farmers who have not yet burnt. And that to us is, if you were looking for a silver lining from the paper, that is the silver lining from the paper, which is that holds the key in the sense that if I take one action, it can have these rippling effects on other farmers in the region. So empowering these bureaucrats can help us make some progress in resolving this problem. This is very different from the typical solutions proposed. Most of them rely on some kind of a Gaussian bargain or like centralizing authority. I think in this case, those problems are more difficult to administer because the way the bureaucracy is set up, just saying that the center now has control over air pollution is not going to resolve it, because the agents of the state are still going to be these district bureaucrats, because that's just how bureaucracy runs. So I think thinking carefully about the incentives of these agents is particularly important, and in this paper we've made at least some progress in identifying areas where some progress can be made. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Read off my Saad, why don't you sit with me so I'm not awkwardly the only person up here. Okay, so this was a great paper. I really enjoyed reading it. I want to acknowledge just how much work must have gone into like collecting these data and analyzing them. It's an incredible feat, so congratulations on doing that. Now, I told Saad, who I'm fortunate to be friends with, that this is completely out of my wheelhouse. I don't study bureaucracies and I don't study climate change. But my father is a farmer and my mother was a bureaucrat, so take that for what it's worth. But anyway, sort of the comments are going to be a series of questions and concerns that you would get from non-specialists, which is going to be at least some of your audience. And it might be the case that some of these are already dealt with through your empirical strategy and your research design, but in that case, just take them as comments to maybe clarify more upfront what alternative arguments you can deal with in your research strategy and which ones you can't. So this paper addresses the very severe issue of air pollution in South Asia. About a third of this air pollution, according to this paper, comes from crop residue burning. And despite existing regulations against crop burning in both India and Pakistan, the implementation remains challenging, as it does in many other areas of policy. So one of the contributions that I see of this paper is showing us that there's actually true variation in this implementation. And in particular, the argument is that bureaucratic incentives play a significant role in controlling pollution, and that bureaucrats are more likely to control crop residue burning when such burning affects their own district as opposed to neighboring districts. So I buy the basic claim that's being made here, which is that bureaucrats are more likely to act against crop burning when it affects their own district versus another district. I think that's very intuitive and not entirely surprising. It's actually more surprising that bureaucrats are doing anything. But conditional on them doing something, it makes more sense that they would do it if it affects their district as opposed to another district. So that's eminently reasonable. But my questions are more about the causal story, the mechanisms, the generalizability, and the policy implications. So to start off, it would be useful to get more explicit clarification on the causal story, and this relates to a question that you got earlier about these bureaucrats and who they are. So in particular, the costs that bureaucrats face are very fuzzy to me in the way that the paper is currently written. So it's not clear what exactly these incentives are that the whole paper is writing on. What do they lose when they fail to act, and what do they gain when they do act? So there's a black box in between the pollution of their home district and them taking action to curb this pollution. In section 2.3, which is titled Bureaucrats and Farmers' Incentives, it's only about half a page and provides a very thin story in response to these questions. So for example, you say that they might face costs arising from farmers' complaints. Who are farmers complaining to? What kind of power do farmers have in this situation? Does it matter whether the district is dominated by large land holdings or smaller land holdings? Can you talk us through how a farmer's complaint to whoever, I'm not sure who they're complaining to, would hurt a bureaucrat's career? You also mention in footnote 2 that it might be because of citizen pressure. But what exactly does this look like for bureaucrats? Especially when, as you mentioned later, the bureaucrats' careers do not depend on citizens, they depend on upper-level bureaucrats. So why would bureaucrats care about citizen pressure? And how is this pressure applied by citizens? What is the form that it takes? Is it in the form of protests? Is it petitions? Do people show up at the office? So to sum up, it would be great to know more about what power both citizens and farmers have in this situation, and what does this pressure look like? What form does it take? And why do bureaucrats cave to this pressure, given that they answer to upper-level bureaucrats? And in that case, why do upper-level bureaucrats enforce good behavior in this particular policy realm? So one alternative story that I can think of to explain your results, and I'm not even sure if this is reasonable, but this story has nothing to do with incentives. So imagine the district that you put up for us, where there's a fire in the upper left corner. And if the district is downwind, then it's going to affect more of the district. Maybe it's not about incentives. Maybe it's about information, right? So there's more people downwind. There's a higher probability that someone will report that this fire is causing pollution. And it'll get reported to the bureaucrat, and the bureaucrat will know that there was a fire and they can enforce against the fire, as opposed to if it was upwind. So this has nothing to do with incentives and has everything to do with whether the bureaucrat even finds out that the law is being broken. So just to summarize, it would be great to have sort of more clarity on the cost-benefit calculation or incentives for the bureaucrats. And in particular, there's no discussion of other incentives that bureaucrats routinely face, such as politician pressure or bribery from perhaps even large landholding farmers. So I also have some concerns about the exercise that you do of comparing rice-heavy and non-rice-heavy districts. So if I understand it correctly, your argument is that we see a much larger effect in rice-heavy districts because the incentives to implement policy are much higher in these districts. So it fits your causal story in that way. But it's not immediately obvious that the incentives faced by the bureaucrats in these areas point entirely in one direction. So on the one hand, as per your interpretation, these are the areas which see the largest amount of damage because they see the most fires during harvest months. And because this damage is higher to the constituents, bureaucrats will face more pressure from their constituents to control the burning. Well, this is sort of assuming that bureaucrats are responsive to constituents, which is something I've questioned earlier. But if a rice-producing area is one that is defined in your analysis as having a larger than median area of the grid devoted to rice crop production, wouldn't the rice farmers also be important constituents in these areas? So don't they contribute to the local economy? Why are they not the constituents that the bureaucrats also must respond to, if indeed bureaucrats are responding to constituents? There's also at least one other interpretation for why you would see this effect be larger in rice-heavy districts, which is that state capacity is higher in these districts. So in section 4.2, titled Larger Constraints Increase Strategic Pattern in Data, you argue, quote, consider the case in which two administrators have the same resources, but the problem of crop stubble burning is much larger in one versus the other. This is the case in districts where a large share of the area cultivates rice crops relative to districts where rice production area is minimal. But this thought experiment is not reflected in your empirics, where you don't provide evidence that the bureaucrats in rice-heavy districts have the, quote, same resources as the bureaucrats in non-rice-heavy districts. And at least in the case of Pakistan, I can think of many rice-heavy districts that probably have higher state capacity than non-rice-heavy districts. So the ones that I'm thinking of are Gujranwala, Sialkot, Shekhupura. I mean, these are like, they have large urban centers. They have lots of military cantonments, which is its own state capacity thing. They're generally richer. They're more developed. They might be places where good bureaucrats are posted. I mean, there's lots of things that are different across these districts. And I know you can't fully deal with all of them, but the sort of like some sort of head-on dealing with these things would be good, I think, for the paper. So, and it's not just state capacity that varies across these two districts. So a related question I have is about your choice of states or provinces to analyze. So this is probably going to be, I don't know what the number is now after the flooding in Pakistan last year, but Sindh produces about 40% of the rice in Pakistan. And so it's a little strange that Sindh is not in this analysis because it's a major rice producing region, and it's also in the map that you showed us on slide 2, it's an area where you see lots and lots of crop burning. So I would be curious to see whether you find the same strong effect in the rice-producing districts of Sindh, such as Larkana, Sakar, Jacobabad. And my prior would be no, because Sindh is a total mess compared to Punjab in terms of state capacity and political accountability for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons is that large land holdings and these like Vaderas, feudal landlords, are very politically important in Sindh. And so I have a hard time believing that bureaucrats in these areas would be able to control crop burning in the same way in Sindh as they can in Punjab. So presumably you have the data or can collect the data. So I'd like to see what the results are for this other major rice-producing province in Pakistan. And in general, I think it would be good to get some clarity on why you picked these 5 states and provinces. So your reasoning in the paper is that these are places where crop burning is particularly salient because rates of crop burning are high. But a more principled way to do this would be to define quantitatively what counts as particularly high, or some ranges, and then to conduct your analyses on the states and provinces where this threshold is met. So my guess is that Sindh would then be a part of your analysis if you were to do that. But this threshold idea, or the idea to focus only on states where crop burning is a salient problem, might create some issues of generalizability. And this is not an argument that we need to generalize everywhere. I think it's important enough to study on its own for reasons that I think are very clear both in the paper and in the presentation. But it's more a comment about defining your scope conditions. So you rightly point to how important the case of South Asia is. It's the most polluted region in the world. And in this region, much of the magnitude of this effect is driven by these regions. But that makes it important to study. But one might counter this by saying that your results apply to extreme cases where bureaucrats have no choice but to at least do their job a little bit because the stakes are very high and the failure is noticeable and salient. So can this tell us much about the implementation of climate protection policies where the externalities of individually rational behavior are not as noticeable or salient? And this is really, again, just a comment about scope conditions or thinking about maybe future research directions. And then finally, I'd like to hear more concretely about what you think the policy implications are of these findings. So if I'm being pessimistic, there's no direct policy implications that follow from this exercise. It's largely a story that is extremely common in South Asia and much of the developing world, which is that bureaucrats are capable of enforcement and doing their jobs properly to a much greater degree than they actually do, either because they don't care to or because they face politician pressure or whatever incentives they have. And it's mostly when a problem is very salient and directly affects their jurisdiction that they're able to enforce policies. So in the pessimistic way that I read the paper, it highlights a huge problem. And without a clear causal story about what these incentives are and enforcement, the policy implications of this pattern are less clear to me. So it would be great to hear your thoughts on what types of interventions you think this causal interpretation points to. And I just want to congratulate you again on this great paper.
Thank you.
Maybe we can get comments from Arvind as well, and then you can respond.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for inviting me to discuss this terrific paper. Maybe a lot of this is beyond my pay grade, but let me try and kind of add to what was just said by Mashail. Firstly, I agree. Really a terrific paper in terms of all the data compiled, the kind of ideas, the main reduced form effects. I agree are quite compelling. A first broad point is that I would really urge Saad and Emma to make this into two rather than one paper, because I think there's a whole, the bureaucratic incentive enforcement story, and then there's the health impact story, which I think can be separated out. At the moment, I think the paper a little bit suffers from kind of rushing to try to cover everything, and instead, if you kind of the fare is so good that you want more of it, and so having two papers would be nice to really go through in detail some of the things that are being discussed here. So that's my kind of broad comment. My main observation is exactly what Mashail said. I think the reduced form effects are compelling, fairly robust. It's this whole mechanism, how this happens, is where I'm still struggling to kind of understand the paper properly. In addition to the kind of the questions that were raised about what are the incentives of bureaucrats to respond in ways? Are they punished? Is it because of farmer protest, et cetera, et cetera? I think that those are, I think, very good questions. But I have a kind of couple more, maybe these are kind of very small and unimportant questions. If the main mechanism is deterrence, Saad, I'd love to see more in terms of how many punishment actions, I still can't get a sense of how many punishment actions are taken kind of relative to the fires. I did some rough numbers. It probably seems like, if I were to go by what you said, for every 1,000 or 10,000 fires, maybe there's one action, but I may be completely wrong with that. So just getting a sense of, how many punishments, actions there are in the data would be actually very useful to know, because if there is some deterrence effect, hopefully, there are enough punishments to kind of create this deterrence effect. And it would be really nice to see, what kinds of, how much punishment is taking place as a result of which you get this deterrence. The other small question I had, I was a bit not clear about, is when you code these punishments, you said you took the data from the, all these are violations of the Air Pollution and Control Act in India, but are they violations of the Air Pollution Act related to crop burning. That was not clear from the paper. Maybe they are, but it would be nice to know, I mean, at least to see that in fact they are related to crop burning violations rather than violations of Air Pollution Control Board more generally, because that would then just mix up the action and the cause for which that action is being taken. So I would really urge you to kind of flesh out that aspect of the paper, that how many punishments are taking place, are they big enough, substantial enough to create this kind of deterrence, and and then maybe spell out that story a little bit more. Also, just to add to some of the comments made earlier, it would be nice to know how bureaucrats, in fact, some qualitative evidence on how do they monitor winds, do they monitor it, and how do they take action, who do they take action against in a district. If there are 10 fires, do they take action against all, against some, what are the criteria they use. That I think that would also be useful to flesh out a little bit more. One thought, I mean, if you were actually trying to tease out the causal mechanisms, I mean, would it make sense to actually put your fines on the left-hand side to kind of demonstrate some kind of mechanism, to show that in fact the number of punishments are in some way driven by the whole setup that you have. So to tease out that, why is it not obvious, or why is it not necessary to put actions on the left-hand side? Another small technical question is that since these fires are so concentrated, should we be looking at kind of narrower windows before and after? Why should the month be the unit of analysis, and why should we be looking at stuff before 6 months? I mean, 6 months before and 6 months after. I mean, is there a case for just making that much more narrow? By the way, I also think, Saad, you have some lovely figures in there. Your first figure I find absolutely fascinating, just the time pattern of these fires, and why is it that in some years you get more, some years you get less. There's a lot of nice variation there, and I would urge you to kind of dwell on that a bit more and discuss that a bit more before setting up this excellent thing that you've done. Couple of last points. One is I would just, in terms of kind of jumping to the optimistic conclusion that, this shows bureaucratic incentives can work, two kind of cautionary points. One is, this is the diff and diff result. I mean, I always think of, the China shock paper, for example, as being a diff and diff result. So it's not clear that this is therefore an average result. And, do we need to be cautious in saying, there's a kind of diff and diff, but, therefore it leads to some average improvement because of bureaucratic intervention is something that I would just raise as a question. Finally, I'm going to pull a bit of rank here and say that, I used to work in the Indian government. I was, chief economic advisor to the government of India between 2014 and 2018. And, this was, the crop burning problem was a really, really serious problem that, we had lots of discussions on. And this is just, you can completely ignore this and, as completely irrelevant. But when we had these discussions, amongst the list of possible solutions, getting bureaucrats to enforce the law and go after farmers was actually never discussed as a serious policy response. And kind of that, if this is right, and this may be completely irrelevant or wrong, but if this is right, it kind of echoes some of the questions that Mashail was asking about, because this thing is so politicized, the political economy of agriculture is so tricky that, the notion that some bureaucrat could actually, take action and that, he would be supported for it and be rewarded for it, that just seems a little bit, I mean, maybe it's plausible, but it seems less plausible than the other possible options we were contemplating. So that's kind of, I do wonder whether, therefore, one should be a little bit cautious about placing our hopes, for this magnitude and this scale and politicized nature of the problem, that somehow we can expect, bureaucrats to, actually enforce the law and get some results is kind of, open, at least in my mind, open to question. The last thing I would say, going back to that, are these things effective? At least when I looked at figure 1, I saw that at least over the last 4 or 5 years, these fires, at least the number of fires has been rising. So I just wonder whether, the average effect is just going in the right direction or not. So these are some, questions, thoughts for you to consider and maybe dismiss mostly. But I do think that there's, there's so much in the paper that certainly you should, make it 2 papers and be a little bit more slow and careful and, elaborate in your development of the causal mechanism. I would urge you to, focus more on that and make it 2 papers. Thank you very much.
Saad, you want to take a little bit of time to respond to any of that?
Yeah, I would mostly thank both Arvind and Mashail for the comments. I think they're absolutely spot on and speak to the kinds of challenges we faced in working on this paper. So, for example, on the one hand, as we started, we were thinking of the large area that we could study with the data that we assemble. But on the other hand, you always run into these problems where the larger you go, the more reduced form the results become, and it's harder. We just don't have the data on specific bureaucratic action for this massive area that we study. So it has to be a little bit of reduced form. So that's the trade-off that we faced and we thought about a lot. We did some field work for it, and we have some ideas, and I think we, as Arvind said, we should definitely provide the qualitative accounts of those field work that we've done in the paper, and we can do that. And so the deterrence results that you saw are I think a 1-week-old result in the paper, and those are brand new precisely for this reason. People are asking, okay, what are bureaucrats doing or could do on the ground? And the problem, theoretically speaking, anything that you can collect data on is going to be an off the equilibrium path kind of a thing, including the FIRs and the Indian case data that we have. This is because if farmers are deterred through a potential action by the bureaucrat, then they should not engage in crop burning, and therefore we should not see the bureaucrat actually taking action against the farmer. So we cannot put these things on the left-hand side as like any data that we could think of that even if we collected, we could not put on the left-hand side because it's hard to think about under what circumstances is that data produced. Likely it's the case where the farmer didn't have a lot of political power, or the bureaucrat really wanted to make an example of some really egregious action, etc. That we ended up seeing some of these things in the data, and it's true that the number of actions that we see in the data is much smaller than the size of the problem. But I think the point we're trying to make, I guess, and we should do it more properly in the paper, is not that this is a rosy picture where bureaucrats' action are creating these massive changes. I think the point is to identify a margin where bureaucrat action can produce some effects, because my sense is, and I'd be very curious to hear from Arvind, what were the policy solutions that they were discussing in these high-level meetings, because my sense from talking to people so far has been that the policy solutions are all carrots and none of them are sticks, as Arvind insinuated, and that might be okay, but I don't think there's any evidence on the efficacy of carrot-based solutions also. For example, the paper that I talked about earlier, which is called Money Not to Burn, they paid farmers not to burn, and it only worked if you paid them before the burning season and only in 8% of the cases. Okay, so you paid them the full amount of the subsidy that was needed to hire a harvester. One interpretation of that is, okay, if you take seriously the credit constraints of farmers and you pay them in advance, it can have some efficacy. In this paper, we're showing the jurisdiction incentives are reducing crop burning by 15%, which is, I think, a significant effect. And I think what we want to say, and we want to say it a bit more subtly in the paper than what it currently says, is this is not the solution, but it should be part of the package of solutions that you might want to think about. And so very quickly, I want to say what are some of the things that can happen. So I interviewed a few bureaucrats for this project. And my sense is that, at least on the Pakistani Punjab, they don't use the Environment Department for any of this control. They use the Agriculture Department, which actually has the mechanisms and the teeth to make things happen. So, for example, they have these extension agents whose job is to go distribute seed, distribute fertilizer, etc. to the farmers. And those are the agents that the bureaucrats use to hold the farmers to account. And so one example that I remember very clearly is that the bureaucrat, in fact, wanted to do a project with us. He said, why don't you give me a forecast of who's going to burn this week, and then I'm going to go and, scream at them before they burn. And in order for us to do that forecast, you need there's only one satellite data that I'm aware of that could even get close to that kind of forecast. It's the planet data. And, as a political scientist, I don't have the tools to even load that data set because it's just so small on my computer. In fact, all of the results you see here are run on the university cluster because they take forever to run. And so that's also one of the reasons for why we had to narrow down on a particular sample, instead of doing the whole thing. But again, I think what I'm trying to say is that we definitely can add some qualitative evidence, and my sense is that, it's like a state capacity is not poor in these areas. These are functional states which have proper organograms. They have specific agents who have contact with the farmers. And so there are personnel of the state who can be exercised to make this happen. Now, is this an average effect? Probably not, because it's, as Arvind said, fires are increasing over time. But there is very interesting and important variation in the data. And I think the point we're trying to make is, instead of always proposing solutions, which are how can we centralize, how can we think of these weak carrots that we can give, perhaps we should also take into account a governance structure that is already built in place, that has fairly high capacity, that works for all other types of issues that we have in the government. And in this paper, we demonstrate that their incentives matter in terms of producing outcomes. So thinking seriously about that and how we can align, perhaps freeing capacity in the bureaucrats level so that they can think about this problem, given the huge externalities it produces, is perhaps important. So that's kind of that's the flavor we want to leave in your mouth. I guess we're not leaving it. So we need to work on the way we write the paper.
So that's Q&A.
Are you sure you want? Danny? No? So actually my comments, this is, first of all, this is amazing, impressive, really detailed and thoughtful work. So, it's great. It was really great reading the paper, and a lot of my comments actually followed directly from Mashail and Arvind's, which is really about, it would be great to have this story that you are, trying to persuade us of, because as Mashail said, the key assumption here is that bureaucrats don't do anything. So when they do, I think is actually really important, far beyond this paper. And clearly, I kind of buy that they are doing something, but I just don't quite know how to make sense of it. And I'll tell you a few things that I think kind of complicated, and perhaps one possible avenue that you can go. So, I find districts a tricky unit of analysis in India. And this kind of foreshadows my comment, which is that you're really treating India and Pakistan exactly the same here. And maybe the administrative structure at the district level is exactly the same, but honestly, I don't know what the administrative structure in Pakistan is. So I would, at the very least, need more information. Districts vary a lot, even within different states in India. And to me, it's a kind of like it's not a great unit of analysis. We call it like a shadowy unit of analysis because there's no politics that happens at the district level, right? There's like no state legislature, in fact, and a lot of the developmental policies are implemented at the block level. So districts are like super large, but they really have this kind of concentration of power and therefore a lot of discretion in the hands of this district collector. So I think the kind of question that Arushi asked, which is, are certain district collectors appointed certain places, just a lot more information on who this individual is, and what their kind of place in the administrative apparatus above and below them would be super helpful, and how that varies between India and Pakistan. So I do know, for instance, that there are cases in which district collectors are appointed because they're supposed to be really good for like communal violence. So there are these people who are like supposed to be really good at like kind of like stomping out Hindu-Muslim violence, and so then they get posted, for instance, in Rajasthan to Tonk, which is the Muslim majority district. So there is something that goes on. So I just want a lot more information about who are these people, how are they selected, how are they appointed, what is within their jurisdiction, and what is their incentives. And because as Mashail said, they're like really accountable not to a political apparatus but to the chief secretary. And again, I'm speaking only for the Indian cases. But like the chief secretary, I just find that idea of why they do it or why they don't, are they rewarded, are they punished, really tricky. Which gets to my more productive kind of constructive comment, I guess, which is that then but I still think the variation is super interesting. And if it's not happening because they're being rewarded or punished for it, then why are they doing it? And here I kept thinking about the point that the Washington Post excerpt that you mentioned was saying about how many of these are Sikh farmers, and so maybe giving them like ideas that conserving nature is within religious precepts is important. And so this kind of gets me back to like, I guess, what I think is super interesting, which is when do bureaucrats do this when actually it's not quote unquote rational for them to do so? Because bureaucrats are career appointments, it's like tenure, right? So no one's gonna fire me. So what incentives do I have for kind of continuing to publish good research? That's the bureaucracy. You get in when you're 29, and essentially you can even like have all allegations of sexual misconduct, or like all the reasons which would get me fired do not hold for a career bureaucrat. So I just think there's a lot of onus on you on why these people are doing this. But I think that one possible direction to explore this, because of this kind of religious interesting angle for places like Punjab, is to see whether they're driven, for instance, by ideas of like subnational solidarity. And the idea here seems to be that they're really doing this because they care about their home district. But under what conditions are they more or less likely to care? Is it when they also belong to the home cadre? Which is an interesting way to do it, because in India, you just get assigned a home cadre if you're at the level of the merit list. Right, so if you're in like the top 10%, you get, or something percent, you get to choose which cadre you're in, and often that means you can choose your home cadre. So is it the case that Sikh district collectors who are from Punjab and have made the system, are they more likely to kind of like do this because they care about their district? Are people who've risen through the state bureaucracy and therefore more likely to be from Punjab more likely? Is it the case when the district identity actually, when the hometown lies within the district, does that matter? I'm thinking of Rikhil Bhavdani and Alex Lee's paper, which kind of talks about this. They kind of manipulate this when they're looking at, completely different outcome variable. But if it is about bureaucratic action, then in terms of parsing out the causal story, I think one way to think about this would be about motivations that are captured through some sense of like, I care about my district, because I just don't think that there's enough of a plausible story that they're doing this because they're being like punished or rewarded.
Should we take a couple more questions? Because it sounds like we have a lot. I want to go to Danny and Pedro, but first, Ashu has a question from beyond the grave. He's somehow communicated this to us. He says, Saad, amazing paper. I have one conceptual question, though. Can one explain bureaucratic behavior in agriculture without bringing in the politician or the politician-bureaucratic relationship as a central part of the framework? Take that for what you will.
No, I think these are all great ideas, and we're taking good notes so that we can write many more papers on this stuff. And for sure, like one of the papers that we want to write, now that we've collected some data, so there is no central database on bureaucrats themselves that we can readily use without access to key government ministries, which we don't, we're not very well connected, unfortunately. So we've had to collect this data, manually, and we spent 6 months doing it. So we have some data on bureaucrats' appointments, And I guess the question is how much of it needs to go in here versus future papers. And one idea that we had was exactly this, which is we study bureaucrats who are particularly good at controlling the problem and what happens when they move to a new district, because they do move laterally, and do they take that learning with them. And there are some designs that you can use to study those kinds of, they call movers design, so you can kind of study some of those questions. So that's something we want to do. We had thought of the question of religion also. In fact, I think one of the grant that that Gemma received, maybe you want to say a little bit about that from Brown, had these aspects of this idea was that, okay, what are some places that are being polluted by actions? And if it could be the case that certain religious sites during instances of pilgrimage receive the brunt of pollution, is it the case that bureaucrats exert particular effort to clean up the air around those times? So these are also directions that we're thinking of. We also thought about the politician question, and one way in which we ran it so far, and we instead of making this paper even longer, I think already we have something like 15 exhibits within the paper. We thought we could study the political question in an accompanying paper. But so far what we found is that actually the politics seems to matter not that much. But we've only tested it through one angle so far, which is what happens if what happens if the team of politicians who are elected within the district, because the political jurisdictions are at the sub-district level, we think about what happens if that team is majority of the ruling party of the state versus not. So we compared those two types of teams of politicians, the idea being that politicians might have different incentives from bureaucratic incentives, and I think what we found is that they don't explain anything as far as explaining the patterns in the data go. And so for now we have kind of bracketed that question, but we do want to come back to it because I think politics certainly plays an important role, especially at this point was raised by a few people, when the people who are getting polluted are also the ones who are polluting, right? Which happens in certain parts of the country for sure. So I think that question we want to unpack a bit more, especially because it has ramifications for the way politics unfolds in those regions.
Danny and then
So I have, first of all, I think this is like an intimidatingly impressive paper, so congratulations to both of you on that. I have two questions. One is to think about, so your paper primarily talks about the preemptive policing that bureaucrats do, if I'm understanding correctly, right? But there's also going to be a post-fire response by bureaucrats as to what to do, right? So I think, I'm not sure how you would do this with the empirical setup you have, but it also seems plausible that bureaucrats will, given how important that particular grid cell is for the dispersion of smoke to other places in the district, they would invest more effort into putting out the fire. I'm not sure how easy or how hard it is to put out rice crop fires, but it would seem that they might also be investing in that kind of activity as well in the aftermath of it, conditional on there being a fire, right? So something to also think about. The second thing is I was looking at your treatment variable, and the way you define your treatment or downwind variable is 50% above and below, right? And in a way, your argument it's not really about 50-50 splits. It's more intuitively about the proportion of people or proportion of grid cells that will be afflicted because of the wind, right? So in a way, that binary thing is a little bit weird, and it's somewhat of an arbitrary threshold. So how should you go about dealing with that? Maybe you alter the thresholds, and maybe that's something you've done, or you think of estimating like a continuous. You do a continuous DID where you think about average causal response and dosage, right? So the larger the number of people likely affected, the high intensity of the treatments, instead of just estimating like the ATE or the ATT, right? You're estimating the causal response. So those are sort of things that you might want to do in addition to the 5 million things you did for robustness.
Pedro.
So very nice. I agree that it seems that you have so much that it could be to paper. Regarding, is it the bureaucrats or the farmers? So both could be responding, and if it is the bureaucrat, you have a very nice view that they are responding equally to everybody. And I wonder, could it be that they're responding more to whether they are coughing? I only care if I cough and if my boss is coughing. So, and I wonder if you can exploit that with the capital, where the bureaucrat is, and where the boss, the capital where the boss is. And that there is continuity with the border with Pakistan, which can also explain maybe the effects. So that one could be more about, if it's more about capital, it could tell you more is about the bureaucrats. But then it could be confounded, it has to be about farmers. So if you think about Eleanor Ostrom kind of view of how we solve these type of problems, is we have all these community organizations that help us solve these problems without the state. And to the degree that those follow the same borders as the districts, it will be difficult to separate. So I wonder if there is some variation there between religious or language barriers that could help you to show, no, it's a district, it's not that the farmers may care or have networks that make them behave.
So, again, great questions. So, Danny, we unpack the treatment in many different, all of the ways that you said in the appendix, and the results look the same, including defining them by the number of people, a continuous variable, etc., etc. And then the second part of the results also unpacks the space of just downwind, upwind by this distance to the border idea. So we try to think about that. I think the preemptive versus post response is very interesting, and I think this is what I was trying to say earlier, that if you do see some punishment ex post, it's kind of off the equilibrium. And what we're interested in really is these kind of preemptive actions, which are unfortunately unseen in our data because there's no systematic data that exists for us to really analyze them, unfortunately. I think this idea about the state headquarters, the boss being polluted, is very interesting. We haven't thought of that previously, and that's something definitely that we can test. Because we have the district headquarter information, which is where the bureaucrats sits themselves, and then maybe we can think of the state headquarter as where the central secretariat is sitting, and that's where pollution is most visible. We'll have to think a little bit about how the state secretariat might think of where the pollution, because attribution again is a huge issue here, because I might have poor air, but I have no way of knowing where's the source of that bad air. So we'll have to think a little bit about how that might work.
And just to finger, I would say that the boss would be at the block level. The district is still like thousands of kilometers, so I would say that the boss there, that's that missing administrative unit of analysis.
I see, boss of the extension agent or something who's going to talk to the farmer.
Who does the farmer think is going to come? It's not going to be the district collector herself or himself.
No, I understand, but I think that point is a little different. Or the way I understand your point was to repeat the analysis at a lower bureaucratic rate, like a block level, for example.
We can talk of him.
Yeah. So in any case, I think those are all interesting ideas. Like one thing I wanted to do was, okay, what if the farmer's own house is getting polluted? Because if, you could in theory, see where a farm is in a village versus where the settlement is, and you can see if the settlement is upwind or down, but the problem with this paper is you can continue doing analysis and never submit it, which is certainly what we've been doing. So at some point we had to say, okay, we're going to stop now. But that's certainly an interesting idea that I think we will definitely talk about. So but I think the really important question is whether farmers' own incentives are affecting the patterns that we see in the data, and to the extent that their incentives are not completely collinear with the district boundaries, we are able to show that that's not the case, because we have these placebo boundaries that we can do for every grid cell, and we show that that doesn't explain the result at all. And then we have to rely on the qualitative evidence or qualitative argument that the district identity or community organization or some kind of a district-based intrinsic identity is less likely to explain that result. And that's kind of what we do, because district identities per se are not really, I would conjecture, other South Asians can also perhaps chime in, aren't really a thing. You could think of a religious identity or a ethnic identity, etc. But those aren't really congruent with the way the district borders are set up are for administrative reasons that have a colonial heritage.
So I don't want to give you guys more analysis to do, but I have two sets of comments. One is going to fall in that bucket, and one maybe not so much. But I guess I was interested in the politician angle, but less about the the way that we think of bureaucrats situated in this like hierarchy of politicians and who they're accountable for, and if they're accountable to a bureaucrat versus a politician, but more of like, if you did this exact analysis with like political boundaries for like assembly constituency level, like you'd probably find the same result. And if we did the exact one at the parliamentary level, we'd probably find the same result. And if we did it at the village level, we'd probably find the same result. And so like I'm just trying to understand if it's like a story about political elites in general and the incentives they have to try to stop it, because all of these actors have ways to stop crop burning. It may not be like the arresting or the fining that like the district level has, but like politicians can definitely play a role in giving resources to stop these issues or not. Village level leaders often play a role in social sanctioning. And so I guess like one option is you know, your story is about bureaucratic incentives, but it's possible that it's just a general story about like political elites who play a role in this and the variety of incentives they might have. So it may be useful to like think about if it makes sense to running it at these other jurisdictional boundaries. And then the second one is like a lot of the setup of like how farmers think about whether or not to do this like hinges on the idea that it's like individually rational, and I think that that focuses primarily on like the economic costs of doing it, but there are huge social costs to engaging in this when you're living in a village and you're going to the farm areas with the same people who you live with. And so I think like recognizing that from the start could be like a useful way to think about like the set of reasons why someone might stop burning, because then that would play maybe a bit more of a role when you get to your result on like the punishment angle, because you might be fearful not just of like the actual punishment, but of the social costs that come along with that punishment.
Yeah, I think great ideas, all of them. I don't think we've tried the running the NAS with any political boundary in the last however many years we've been working on this. But that's something we can definitely try, and I think it's on our very long list of things to do. And I think we wanted to explore the political dynamics in a separate paper, which we will only work on after we submit this paper. I think that's what we that's what we promised ourselves. But it's definitely a thing that we want to explore. I think the social cause is kind of interesting now that you mention it. You know, like one way in which we could do this is we have this DHS data, so we know presumably how many pregnant women there are at any point in time, or not any point, but during the DHS window in a location. So you could potentially think about, you know, what happens if the smoke is going to go to your community, which has, that could be one way of, I think, but at the end of the day, I think the logic from the farmer's perspective is so skewed. You know, I think we literally have a quote in the paper that, you know, why would I not burn when all I have to do is purchase a matchbox? You know, so in terms of the cost-benefit calculus, it is so skewed that, you know, the farm sizes are going smaller and smaller, so the bottom line is getting hit for all the farmers, and they're very, they have to like really think of the economics of their decisions. So from that perspective, I think, for me, it's believable that they always prefer the quote-unquote rational action versus some of these other social costs of not burning, etc. So that's where I would leave it, but I think we can potentially make some progress on it in the medium run.
I'll say some more. You guys should submit this paper, and don't drive yourselves crazy. I do think the reduced form is frustrating because it does seem. I mean, I think for reasons that others have articulated, like it's hard to understand what the incentives really are or where they're coming from. It's hard to believe that these district bureaucrats know that they have such a sophisticated. I mean, to be completely. I've not spent any time in Pakistan. I have no idea, but it just seems sort of far-fetched that they would have such a sophisticated understanding of, wind patterns that they would, and to sort of the internal geography of their own districts, that they would respond so precisely to these changing winds. So, anything you can do, and I think, and maybe some of the qualitative evidence is the answer, but I also think some of these other ideas, like thinking about when would we expect these incentives to really kick in? So maybe it is around religious holidays, or maybe it is something about ethnicity, or I don't know exactly, but that seems like it would be useful just to give the reduced form a little bit more bite, to convince us like, okay, this really does have something to do with incentives, because also it's not just that punishment is off the equilibrium path, like the fires themselves, so, you know, if you think about this as sort of a, you know, this is a long-term, you know, a dynamic game, and I know, you know, I'm a farmer, and I know that the politician, the bureaucrat's gonna come punish me if I burn, so I don't burn, and it has actually nothing to do really, like, the bureaucrat's incentive isn't what's actually doing the work here, it's just that I'm sort of anticipating this behavior, right? But now, like, now I have to be so, like, it just is, it sort of boggles the mind, the level of sophistication that would be required for this equilibrium to really set in. You know, so I don't know, I just have a hard time wrapping my head around it, and I think anything you guys can do to suggest that, like, look, these are, you know, this is happening more at times than we would really expect. And the border, the India-Pakistan border example, that's a nice one there, you know, where it does kind of suggest, okay, I can see where the incentives are you know, are sort of different in these two different areas, and but more like that would certainly help me.
Yeah, and I think we certainly, I mean, we have some evidence on this, and we can certainly add more in, like, not everything was presented in the, today.
And we also dropped results from the paper because the paper is just long. We have other results that are in line with this story.
So one result that we dropped was, which we Gemma wants it in the paper, I want it dropped, is that the results become stronger the closer you get to a main road. And this was a hypothesis given to me in an interview with one of these bureaucrats who said, I would care about this area because this is the area that my boss is likely to see, like visually see a farm being burnt, and therefore, and in fact, we find that results are stronger
Kilometers of distance
to the. And so I guess the question is, how many weak results can you add to the paper before the paper is rejectable?
I think some of this stuff is sort of, you know,
yeah. So I think
it's like bells and whistles at the end that you probably don't really need. Like the child mortality results, like those are interesting, but I don't know, you know, they don't feel like they belong in the paper to me. Whereas these other things, like I think this question of incentives is very interesting, because my assumption would be bureaucrats don't do anything. They don't, you know. Bureaucrats sit on their hands.
So it's kind of interesting. Saad said that, oh, I would expect this at every single jurisdiction that you can think of. So I think you get both flavors of comments, which is, this should replicate in every elite jurisdiction, or that they should not matter anywhere. Okay.
Exactly. Right? Like
See,
village
that's the
level
big
clerks or
definition.
punches are getting votes, like MLAs are getting votes, MPs are getting votes. Bureaucrats are getting like 0 votes.
Okay, so if we find that
this is another area where I think so taking that comment seriously, and like, you know, again, this is just asking you to do more stuff, which is not fair. But that's an example where, okay, I really see where the incentives come. If you're an elected leader, now I see where the incentives are coming from, right?
So if you could show find no effects on the elected leaders and all the effects are on the bureaucracy, then you'd be.
I would be perplexed.
Because that's because both of you are political scientists. That's why. No, I mean, I think like you go. I think if you present this in economics seminar, they'd be like, yeah, the politics shouldn't matter. If we have some economics, you know.
But you shouldn't listen to them if they say that, because we know the politics matter for bureaucracy.
Okay, so I think we can. I think that, but that should be easy in the sense it'll take us a month of work to run that. We can probably do that. Yeah. So we can definitely do that and see what we find. But I think the general point that we need more, if not quantitative, at least qualitative evidence on some of these things is very well received. I've taken very detailed notes. We will work on that. And then perhaps other suggestive results are actually helpful because they give a more of a flavor of what's happening under the hood. And so perhaps we should not delete them and keep them in the paper. We do find, I mean, what is in the paper is that the results, operate in the harvest months, in the rice areas, those kinds of things I didn't get a chance to present today, but, they also increase this idea that, okay, this is not just a random jurisdictional patterns that we're seeing, these are in the areas where you expect this problem to occur. But other results I think that we have that we've kind of removed perhaps should stay in the...
Well, I think it's also the way you package that. So it's not just where you would expect the problem to occur, but where you would expect the incentives to really bite.
Exactly, I understand.
That's, I want to see a list, like here's this is a story about incentives, we have no direct measure of incentives, right? And we have no direct measure of bureaucrat behavior, but what we can show you is in all of these cases where you would expect the incentives to be stronger, that's where we observe more of this action, right? And that just helps convince me, like, okay, that's actually what's happening underneath these reduced form results.
Yeah, totally. and I get that. Yeah, we will work on that.
I don't actually know how long this seminar goes.
I love that. 6 o'clock.
6 o'clock. I hope there are more questions.
We usually end just before, like we end 3:45.
Great. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
So in terms of like the policy relevance of this theory that you're proposing, do you have a sense of what the movable margin is on the end of the farmers? So for instance, like maybe you can disincentivize a certain number of farmers to stop burning. But if there's a point beyond which the only reason I'm not burning is that I just can't afford, I just cannot afford to hire the harvester or whatever. Do you have a sense of if that's a really small proportion or if that's a large proportion of the farmers in this area?
Yeah, so I think that's a whole other challenge, right? So as I said, there's this other paper on paying farmers to not burn. One reading is, okay, there's significant treatment effects and there's an 8% decrease in the farmers who burn. Only when you pay them in advance. It doesn't happen if you pay them ex post after verifying that they did not burn. I mean, on one hand, it's a very encouraging finding, but on the other hand, also tells you that the bottom line for the farmer is actually not that great. And so, what are some movable margins? I think they'll have to be the ones where they're never going to bring it down to a cost of buying a matchbox, right? But the closer you get to that, which is, okay, make harvesters available. I think governments are aware of that, and from my understanding, they're buying a lot of happy seeders, make them available for free, make them available at the farm, and not like have this complicated process of going to the tehsil office or district office and getting them from there, etc. So the more you can reduce the cost, the more you can move, I think, the farmers on this. But at the end of the day, you're competing against the price of a matchbox, and so that's really the big policy challenge from the farmer's perspective. Yeah, so the time increases, so they have a 2-week window to where they have, imagine if they had 6 months, then it wouldn't really matter, right? Then you could be like, okay, whenever you have time, whatever, we make labor available. That's the window where everybody is harvesting and sowing the next crop. So that, yeah, so it's not, it's a matchbox, but also the limited amount of time when they must clear the field for the next crop.
I have one more question from Ashu from Beyond the Grave, and it starts with a very Ashu preamble. It is aesthetically gruesome and brutal to critique a paper of such marvelous quality. If I am doing so, it's only because I think Saad and Gemma can climb Himalayan heights and be trailblazing. Now to the question. While it is clear that the civil service in India and Pakistan is historically similar, do today's district collectors face similar incentives and disincentives? Inter alia, are their agrarian structures similar? So this actually, I think, connects to something that Mashail was saying. Pakistani and Indian Punjab are similar. Haryana and Western UP have roughly the same agrarian structure as the two Punjabs, but are you by any chance including Eastern UP and Bihar in your empirical analysis? The last two are more likely to be closer to Sindh than Mashail referred to. To use the technical distinction, it is one between Zamindari and Yotwari. Sorry. The key implication is that some of the landlords in these areas are so powerful that it is virtually impossible for the bureaucrats to punish them. That, I think, was a point that Mashail made. At the very least, the agrarian structure needs to be ruled out as analytically invalid.
No, I think this is an excellent point, and I don't know this literature super well, but presumably there's data that we can collect on farm size to proxy for farmer political strength to study this question. My understanding is that, again, as Ashu said, in Punjab, Haryana, etc., farm sizes are decreasing. I think somebody made the comment that land reform is no longer needed because just through intergenerational transfers, farm sizes have become so small that it's not really a problem. But in other parts of the country, like Sindh or maybe Eastern UP, these are still, farm sizes are still very big, and perhaps we can get data on this and study it.
But another answer is also that we did run the analysis on CMMBR and we found similar results.
Right. I think we dropped them for computational reasons because everything was taking forever. We did have Sindh at the beginning.
And also Bihar.
And also
so
Bihar.
We have run the results on them and they are similar.
Yeah. So this is a great point. I mean, I think we need to get some data on this to think about this a bit more.
Last comments or questions? Okay. right, well, join me in thanking Saad and Gemma.